And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. With me today is Michael Graves, and with us again is Mr. Richard Field from, where you at, Fullerton or somewhere down south that you're joining us from these days, right, Richard?
Yeah, Fullerton, Orange County, home of the Orange County Register, the only libertarian newspaper in the country, I think.
Well, you know, we're glad to have you back. We miss you around here, I tell you. We really do miss you around here, so it's nice to have you again. So we're going to start here with, up here locally, Placer County has started work on a $120 million waste recycling center. This is because the state has mandated that compostable materials, 75% of compostable materials, be removed from landfills. But landfills need this type of material to work. Compostable materials actually help landfills function, so they're going to have to replace this with enzymes and other tricks to make landfills work properly. And you're adding the extra addition of, you know, extra trucks and extra transportation costs and environmental costs of extra transportation. Is this actually good for the environment? And if it's not, who's it really good for? Michael, you got to...
Well, James, to your point, yeah, I mean, this just seems like just a typical government boondoggle, trying to do something by mandate that, you know, really is counterproductive, that is, you know, seems like an unnecessary facility, and really is going to, in the name of environmentalism, set back the environment. That you know, mandating this target, you know, compostable materials in landfills, you know, to begin with, is probably, you know, number 100 or so on my list of environmental concerns. Compostable materials are basically biodegradable. So this, but, you know, they passed this regulation, you know, with good intentions, I'm sure, and you know, a bunch of resources are going to be wasted on this. They're going to burn a bunch of fuel that doesn't need to be burned. You know, they're going to, you know, pull a bunch of delivery trucks into service that don't need to be put to that purpose. So, yeah, sounds like typical government to me.
Yeah, Richard, we've seen this before with recycling, right? We saw it with cardboard recycling and all the various recyclings, where by the time they picked up the extra recycling, put it on a, you know, sorted it out, put it on a truck, then collected it, put it on a boat, sent it to China, the environmental benefits were, you know, erased, essentially, if not, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Obliterated. There was no environmental benefits from that process. And
yeah, well, I'm sure that there will be some construction unions and construction companies that will benefit, at least in the short term.
Yeah, so, but who is benefiting in the long term? Is it just politicians, you know, claiming that they've done something? Is that really this,
well,
you know?
I mean, if, in fact, as you guys say, there's no real discernible long-term environmental benefit, then nobody benefits in the long term, other than the developer or the construction company who might be able to invest the money that he makes by doing this very expensive project.
Yeah, and that is the thing. We're spending a lot of taxpayer money that we don't have. We have what's the deficit in California in here? We've got the state deficit. It's like $10 billion or something, the projected deficit. I forget how much it was, but it was a ridiculous amount of money. And yet they still managed to put in mandate after mandate that, you know, California is losing population, and we're now starting to lose our high-end population. Who's going to pay for all this?
Yeah, I do think.
Back in 1992, I ran for state assembly, and I was informed by the incumbent. The counties, and this is a county project, the counties are there only to administrate what the state tells them to do, and I suspect this falls under that category.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that these days, haven't we, Michael? Where that view of the higher government authority is just there to tell the lower government authority what to do and how to act, not necessarily how it's supposed to be, where essentially it's supposed to work the other way around, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's deep in the American tradition to devolve power to the lower levels wherever possible. That's why, you know, the school systems are typically retained in local control. There's many functions that are devolved to the county and city level, local levels. But I just think that this sort of thing, that's exactly right. That basically the state governments, what happens is this is the the larger body with the bigger budget, with more centralized power, and especially in a state like California, you just have that ratchet continuing to turn. That mandates are imposed from on high by these politicians who just really, it's not really a local matter. It's executed locally, and there's political pressure on the localities to do this. But it's I mean, you tell me, James, is this 75% reduction mandate, is that a Placer County initiative, or is that a...
It's a state mandate.
That sounds like the state of California.
Yeah, every county has to go through. This is why we have just outside the studio, there's a trash bin. Well, it's a compostable bin that nobody uses. It just sits there in the hallway of...
Yeah,
and so you end up with these goofy things where we spent a lot of money to create post bins and compostable bins and trash bins that someone has to come by and check, that no one ever uses.
But this is the sort of dynamic you see with the way that government has their edicts enforced. We saw this with the response to the COVID pandemic, that you have these kind of Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, these unelected bureaucrats at the highest level of the federal government, and they want to do something, and they sort of find a way to apply some pressure, and then the state governments, even the ones that are sort of somewhat ideologically opposed, they sort of haplessly go along with it, and then who actually ends up enforcing these stay-at-home orders and shutting down businesses? It's the local authorities. It's the sheriff that's asked to comply with state laws, even down to in cities like New York and San Francisco, where you basically couldn't go to a restaurant in the city of New York without presenting your papers for a while there. Thankfully, that's been repealed, but that they devolve the enforcement down to the businesses, right? That the individual business, if that's basically who's telling you can't come in here if you didn't get this medical treatment that we said you have to have, and so that's kind of the dynamic that you see time and time again, and so this is just one example.
You got anything to add to that, Richard, before we move on?
No, I don't.
All right. Well, we're gonna talk about continued government pressure. There's a Substack article that we passed around before this, in preparation for the show, and it was a story about how a former CIA official came to lead the U.S. government's effort to stamp out speech that the government doesn't like. And we talk about how government uses pressure on other governments, but government can also use pressure on, whether it be social media companies or a local printing business, right? There's all kinds of pressures that government can use to force voices they don't want heard to not be heard, right? There's various tools in their tool shed, and we seem to be okay with it as a society. And that's, for someone who's been in media for a long time, Richard, is this a scary time, or is this kind of more of the same?
Well, it's more of the same. It's getting worse. I mean, I was involved in media, in a big way back in the 80s and 90s. And back in the 80s, the television, for instance, was divided among three networks. If you weren't ABC, NBC, or CBS, that took up 90% of viewership. Cable, miscellaneous cable channels took up the other 10%. So it was real easy for the government to censor when you had 3 television networks, probably about 3 or 4 radio networks, as far as news is concerned, and really 2 or 3 newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, and maybe the LA Times. If you control all of those media outlets, and the AP, you essentially control the narrative. And the politicians, in fact, did control the narrative. We had a brief opening of actual, real free speech when the internet was new and the politicians couldn't figure out what to do with it. That led to a flowering of divergent and diverse voices on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and elsewhere. But as soon as the politicians figured out that they were losing control of the narrative, they immediately and with force decided to come down on social media big time with the threat regulation. The threat of regulation is what is the hammer that government always has to wield over media or anything else. If you're reading the Twitter files, you know, an old school liberal, Matt Taibbi, the guy that coined the phrase vampire script to describe Goldman Sachs back in the 90s or 2000s, is now being maligned as some sort of reactionary because he's simply telling the truth that the government was using threats, coercion, and bribery to make sure that Twitter followed the official narrative out of Washington when it came to the election of 2020, when it came to the pandemic coverage, when it came to the lockdowns, you name it. You know, a whole lot of very reputable and respectable epidemiologists and other medical practitioners said that the lockdowns and the approach to the pandemic was not only not scientifically valid, but it was counterproductive. Those voices were effectively squelched. They were pushed into the shadows and marginalized so-called conspiracy theories. That's the problem that we have now. If you don't toe the line on the narrative out of Washington, you can't get heard. Your soapbox is in fact that, a soapbox, you know, somebody standing on a street corner with a bullhorn standing on top of a soapbox. That's the point we've gotten ourselves to. The only saving grace is you've got a number of competing elites, each trying to get out their own version of what should be said. And to the extent that Fox disagrees with MSNBC, you've got a little bit of diversity, but not much.
That's kind of a phony diversity, isn't it? Because it's the two sides of the same coin. So while it is diversity, it's not really. It's like saying, you know, the heads of a nickel and tails of a nickel are different. Well, yeah, but it's still the same coin. You have any thoughts on this, Michael?
Well, that's all true, but you know, I do want to emphasize the first part of what you said, Richard, which is that there has been this major move with the advent of the internet towards a diversity and plurality of information sources. And you're exactly right that this really flowered for many years. I mean, I think it was, there was just a lot of, you know, information out there, and you know, various platforms sprang up. You know, there's YouTube, you know, there's Reddit, there's like a zillion. You know, you can just go find stuff online. You know, I probably was really aided in my journey to becoming an ideological libertarian because I, you know, found a bunch of, you know, Tom Woods YouTube videos, right? You know, 30 years before that, that would not have been possible. And so there really, of course, what sort of happened is government and sort of even non-government sort of power centers that benefited from the old arrangement where you really could sort of put all the information through just a smaller number of channels and control the narrative. They've really tried to push back hard and put the genie back in the bottle. I think the good news is putting the toothpaste back in the tube is really very hard to do. You know, it's disconcerting to see because you really do have, I mean, I think you could see that things were not going in a great direction as far back as the Obama years when, you know, around the time of the Edward Snowden leaks, I think it came to light that the federal government, you know, I think it was maybe the FBI or somebody, but basically that they had asked for access to private information from essentially all of the big tech companies, right? Like Google, you know, they essentially really were at least requesting the right to read just everyone's emails if they want to, right? And that happened back in like, yeah, you know, 2000, I forget, 13 or 14 or something like that. So this has been kind of building for a while. You know, once that shoe dropped, you know, you could see it in you know, for, you know, the people who managed those companies weren't talking about it initially. And then once it became public, they couldn't really deny that that was happening. They said, well, look, what are we supposed to do, right? You know, basically, people from the government came and said, look, you run your business, make money if you want to, but if you don't comply, we're going to shut you down, right? We're going to make your life impossible. And so they complied. Perhaps they shouldn't have, or, you know, I don't know how much realistic capacity they had to push back, but the point is they did. And once they're doing that, you can't really regard these purported private organizations as independent of the government. The government is insisting on the right to use these to put their thumb on the scale and editorialize and control narrative. And but the simple fact of the matter is there's continued pushback, and they're really not able to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right?
Well, and the use of algorithms to control what people what people see, what people can read, what people can listen to. It can only work for so long until someone else comes up with a new algorithm, right? Google is essentially worthless now as a search engine. It's pointless.
It's getting pretty bad, yeah. I mean,
you've got to go to
the most important search results, especially if you're interested in controversial topics, they're not at the top of the
you got to go down
list
to page
anymore.
10. You go to page,
so what's the
page
use
10.
of something like that? Yeah.
And so it's become useless, and so people are starting to search for other alternatives, and those alternatives kind of you can play whack-a-mole with them, but essentially people learn to play whack-a-mole, and so that's kind of it's a strange world we're living in, where we have certain media outlets are restricted from saying certain things and having certain narratives, but other media outlets are protected by the White House. Karine Jean-Pierre, God, I butcher her name every time, and I apologize. It's Karine Jean-Pierre. Is that correct?
Jean-Pierre, I guess.
Jean-Pierre? I butcher names. She defended the independence of NPR journalists, I'm going to use air quotes here in journalists, because saying they're independent journalists, they don't have a tie to the government or whatever. But NPR certainly does have a government narrative that they tell, and it's not surprising considering where they get most of their funding from, right? NPR is not like, say, Sesame Street, which gets a lot of their funding from, you know, licensing and all that. This is, I mean, Sesame Street could actually function on their own. NPR couldn't function without government funding. And so when you have the White House defending a news organization that gets government money while attacking news organizations and individuals for spreading misinformation or alleged misinformation, is that not a problem? Is that not yet another example of the government putting their thumbs on the scale of information?
Oh, it absolutely is, and this is just ridiculous. I mean, you can't, the whole claim shouldn't be humored that you know, NPR's journalists are independent. What does that even mean? If you're on, you know, the payroll of the government or anyone, how can you be independent from them if that's who's writing your paycheck? It doesn't make any sense. You know, good, you know, left-wing progressive types, you know, they would never accept this as a, you know, defending the independence of, you know, those, you know, environmental studies that were financed by the, you know, big oil, right? You would never say, oh yeah, like that's probably independent. Nobody, that's just,
yeah,
that's not what we're talking about. You just laugh that out of the room, and then we don't have to talk about it.
Yeah, this notion that you get independence from the money from the government, especially when you're in media, right? Is that kind of a foolhardy description, I suppose, Richard? Where?
Well, I mean, the story of how the Soviets did it comes to mind. If you know, in the Soviet Union, you were, you know, the Soviet Union rulers, the autocrats that ran the Soviet Union would very clearly say, you are free, absolutely free to do whatever you want to do. You're free to say whatever you want to say, as long as we agree with it.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we're getting to. We're going to go ahead and move on again. Chicago had an election the other day, and well, it turns out that they booted their old mayor because she was incompetent, but then they went ahead and reelected someone who's going to implement the exact same policies. They got these people who think that the problem with Chicago is the person in charge and not the policies they are attempting to implement. How are you going to get different results by having essentially the new boss being the same as the old? Am I wrong here, Richard? Or is that what it looks like?
No, you're not going to get different results. I mean, but Chicago is an interesting city. I mean, going back to Boss Daly, it's a city that's always been run by ward politics and with a huge influence among the public sector unions. The guy that got elected mayor in Chicago had the backing of the public sector unions, and I think that says it all. And it's, it's ward politics. It's ward healer politics, and it's not going to change as long as Chicago is on the map. And Chicago has always had, or for a very long time, has had very stringent gun control laws and a very high murder rate. The two go hand in hand. I mean, it's not a coincidence that when you take guns away from people who are trying to protect themselves and make them illegal, that those who don't particularly care about the law anyway are going to have the guns and kind of what they want. That's what's happened in Chicago, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, and a whole lot of other places where gun control has empirically proven time and time again that it doesn't work. And then the other part of Chicago is, like all, well, not all, but most jurisdictions in the United States, there's a whole lot of victimless crimes on the books. So you'll have police spending a fortune going after low-level drug users and gamblers and prostitutes and other victimless crimes, and not having the resources, so to speak, so they claim, to go after murder, robbery, and rape. It's a matter of priorities, and the priorities have always been on what the politicians think is going to get them the best headlines. And in Chicago, going after vice, even though it exists with a vengeance, has always gotten headlines, whereas going after the perpetrators of violent crime doesn't necessarily get those same headlines.
Machine politics, the big machine politics, is a failure every place it's tried, but yet somehow places like San Francisco, New York, Boston, are functionally failures. But places like Sacramento are following along that path for some reason. Is this a danger for these cities, these second-tier, third-tier cities that are starting to grow as we become more machine politics, as the machine politics takes over? How dangerous is that for places like Sacramento?
Yeah, it's true. These basically, this governance model of you kind of have a big city with like a million or a couple million people living there, and then you sort of there's the strong mayor model, and you sort of New York has 5 boroughs that used to be separate, but they get united into one polity, and all these kinds of things, and then now we're going to have an election, and we're going to elect someone that people like, and then it just there's not a lot of room for this is better than state level politics, but there's still not a lot of room for dissent and people doing things a different way if they want to. And,
if you want to engage in politics, you essentially have to join the political machine, and then you become part of the political machine, the machine politics. Yeah. And it's a downward spiral. It's a downward cycle that you end up with Chicago if it goes on too long, right?
Well, I think the saying is you can't fight City Hall, right? And it's, there are things you could do about this. You could not have you could subdivide it into smaller political organizations. You could devolve some of the powers out of the city government there. Some of the most onerous laws in the San Francisco Bay Area are local laws that impose these crazy rent controls, and you can't building codes. You can't build more than 3 stories in some of the most valuable real estate in the world. But what are you going to do about it? You can't fight City Hall, right? It just, if enough of your, in this kind of arbitrarily defined sub-jurisdiction, if enough of your neighbors want to vote for that, if you don't like it, you can move, I guess.
That's the only choice, right? And
that's better than nothing.
But we live in a world where if you're on the 45% of the time, on the 45% of the electoral dial, you are essentially governed by someone who is completely opposite from you, who no longer has a representative mindset. Their mindset is kind of their own narrow worldview, and they don't represent you anymore. It's kind of a sad thing. But we're going to move on down to L.A. The L.A. police officers filed a claim, and this is kind of a strange one to explain. The L.A. police officers filed a claim against the sheriff's department for releasing their information, pictures and basic information that's they're legally, that a activist group got the judge to force them to release, but they released some police officers who were undercover, which they supposedly don't have to release or something. Anyway, the watchers down in LA don't like being watched, is essentially what happens. The same people who watch us, put cameras up everywhere, watch you, will follow you around, don't like having their names and faces out there so you can watch them. And I think that's kind of it's an interesting issue, is like, because you can get it. You can understand why a police detective who's working undercover might need to be protected, but why would a rank and file beat cop need to be protected? You're working out in the public on a day-to-day basis, and you are the face of the law. You're the face of the government. You need to be public. That's kind of the whole point, is it not? Richard? Is that?
Two thoughts on that. One is the hypocrisy of it. If you take the FBI, for an example, it's illegal for you to lie to the FBI. It's a felony.
Right.
But it's perfectly legal for the FBI to lie to whoever they're grilling. So you know, it's a totally hypocritical system. Getting back to LA, it's interesting to me to note that the people who are screaming the loudest about having their visages all over the internet or wherever it's being exposed are undercover cops. What do you need undercover cops for? The only thing that you need undercover cops for is victimless crimes, because whenever you have a crime with a victim, the victim will come forward, right, and you don't need an undercover cop to ferret it out. Undercover cops are used for vice crimes. They're used for drug crimes. They're used for prostitution. They're used for illegal betting. All of the crimes where everybody involved is participating willingly shouldn't be a crime at all. The only way that you can make a case is by sneaking in, pretending you're not a cop, and then basically putting together an entrapment situation. Of course, they don't want their faces on the publicized, because that would make it impossible for them to continue to set traps for the perpetrators of victimless crimes. Get rid of the victimless crimes. This is not an issue.
Yeah, and what did they tell us? If you don't have anything if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. Isn't that what they tell us? So why does that not apply to them?
Yeah, again, hypocrisy.
Yeah, is it kind of my thought, Michael, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think police. Yeah, this is the same sort of thing where government agents. There's no principled reason why government agents should have this type of special protection. You know, if they need, it's exactly like you said. Like, there are reasons why I could think of why a police officer might want those types of protections for himself, but like I, as a citizen, also want those protections, but they violate those all the time, and they're not subject to the same laws that they visit upon us.
And we are out of time. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Richard, for being here.
Thank you.
And we will thank you for watching, and we will see you next time. Good night. And please remember to love everybody.